Hey everybody, today I'll be taking a look at this Albion Soldat. This is a one-handed messer made by Albion in the US, and this is my first higher price point sword. And I know that price points, what people consider to be expensive or not expensive, really vary depending on the person. It's a very subjective matter to discuss. But just to kind of give you an idea, I typically play in the $500 and less range. For me, that's what I consider to be about the mid-range for swords. I know custom swords go for considerably more than what I paid for this. Japanese Nihonto, antique swords all go for quite a bit more often. But this, for me, is what I consider to be on the higher price point and is, to date, the most expensive sword that I've purchased. That's not to flex or anything. That's just to say that I'm going to be going into probably a little bit more detail than what I normally do on swords, to the point that it might seem a little bit nitpicky, and that's not my intention to be nitpicky in any way, shape, or form. What I'm going to try to do with this video is just be as detailed as I can about my experience. So if you're looking at purchasing one of these for yourself or another Albion sword, you might have an idea of what to expect from the point of purchase all the way to use. So that way there are no surprises. Of course, everyone's experience is going to be a little bit different, but at least this will give another data point for people to compare to. As I mentioned before, this is a one-handed messer. I'm not going to get much into the history of messers, except to say that messer is a German word meaning knife, and messers are typically qualified by their knife-like hilt construction. Now, from what I understand, a knife-like hilt isn't found on all historical messers, but I'm not really going to get into the details about that in this video. I'm going to save that for an upcoming video that I have planned on my cold steel messers. This Soldat, though, does have that knife-like hilt construction, consisting of a full tang with a slab or a sandwich-type grip, depending on who you ask, made of wood. It also has an overall length of 29.5 inches with a blade length of 24.25 inches. The blade is made of high carbon steel, and I'm not sure what type of steel Albion uses, and Albion's website says that the kind of steel that they use is proprietary information. I'm sure this information exists on some forum post or in another video or in comments on another video somewhere, but I couldn't find it with a cursory Google search. Needless to say, it is high carbon steel. I ordered this sword from Cult of Athena back in August of 2020 and was given a projected wait time of a year or more. Mine was ready to ship to me in August of 2021, so the 1 year estimate was actually pretty close, but Cult of Athena was quick to remind me that actually it was 10 days earlier than a year, 10 days shy of a year, so there you go, a little bit quicker than a year for mine. I put a 25% deposit down on mine, which Cult of Athena allows on some of their swords with longer lead times, but one thing to note if you're going to do this is that your initial payment is going to include the 25% deposit and shipping and tax. So if you do plan on putting some money back in order to put a deposit down, keep in mind that you're going to need more than the actual 25% subtotal. Plan on around $100 or more on top of the 25%. They also gave me the option to cancel my order whenever they called me to let me know that it was ready and would offer me a refund. I can't remember if there was a restocking fee associated with that or not, but I'm guessing possibly not, because they know that they'll have no issue flipping an in-stock special order Albion. All in, I paid a little over $1,300 for the sword with tax and shipping. The sword shipped to me in a very plain, somewhat thin white box with sufficient but scant packaging. I mean, it's fine, I got it here in one piece, but it was kind of funny. It reminded me of how Arsenal AK rifles ship, which are also, if you don't know, are a little more generally limited production / higher price point firearms. So I thought it was kind of interesting how they ship in very similar boxes, of being very plain, just white, nondescript boxes that kind of belie the price point. The sword does not include a scabbard, as is typical of Albion swords, so if you want a scabbard, you're going to have to contract someone like Todd Cutler to make one for you, or make one yourself. Prices I've seen on scabbards seem to start around $500. To be honest, I just bought a $25 machete sheath for mine on Amazon, a leather one, just to cover the blade and transportation, because I typically throw my sword in a rifle case and then carry it if I'm carrying it somewhere, on the rare instances that I do that. Until I can justify the expense of having a proper scabbard made. I plan on doing that. I just need to count on putting back a sword amount of money in order to buy one. The first thing I noticed out of the box on this sword is just how tight the fit and finish is. For the most part, all the lines are very clean. The fittings are all very snug. There are some seam lines and visible but narrow gaps in some places around the hilt, but no slop. The nozzle has the biggest gap, which could be a possible moisture trap and would be something to be aware of during maintenance, especially after cutting water bottles. It doesn't really bother me. It's a cosmetic consideration, but it's something I noticed and worth pointing out. I know that those kind of things bother some people more than others. The false edge is also apexed a little bit unevenly. It looks like an edge that I would cut again, but that's also a small and not really functional issue. The scales are also very nicely smooth. They're a darker wood with a really attractive grain pattern and a very basic and what I would describe as workmanlike finish. So not super high gloss or showy in any way, just very straightforward and workmanlike. The scales are secured to the tang with rivets and are perfectly smooth down to the scales. Everything is very flush and even. The tang is just barely visible through the pommel, but it has been peened and ground so smoothly that it's actually almost a little hard to find. It was really impressive to me just how clean all the fittings are on the sword. The edge geometry was perfect, with a continuous grind from the spine to the edge. I mentioned the false edge, which is unsharpened. That runs about 9.5 inches from the point, which itself is needle-like. The edge is described as a sharp edge, but out of the box cutting performance for this sword I found to be pretty poor with a factory edge. So in spite of the excellent geometry, it just was not sharp enough to cut water bottles and pool noodles. It would break bottles more often than cut them, and it was not paper sharp. Now, I've heard the justification that Albion's edges are intended to be quote-unquote sword sharp, not quote-unquote paper sharp, but I do quote-unquote backyard cutting. I'm not bringing a sword against battlefield armor or shields, so cutting performance for me is measured against the media that I cut, which is water bottles, pool noodles, tatami mats, etc. And I found that factory edge to be pretty disappointing. At least from a sharpness standpoint. Again, from a geometry standpoint, I have no complaints there. My only point of comparison prior to this was my Cold Steel MAA One-Handed Messer, which I found to be much more consistent in the cut, and that sword was only about $140, so almost 10% of the price of this Albion. So I resolved this issue with the Albion by taking it to a work sharp and just polished up the edge. I didn't have to reprofile the edge at all because the geometry, again, was excellent. I just used a fine grit belt and strop to polish up the edge, and I went ahead and sharpened the false edge as well. And that pretty much turned the sword into a laser. Cutting any type of media with the polished up edge was almost too easy. I let a few people who had limited to no experience with swords cut with it, and even they were able to produce really clean cuts against bottles where the bottoms were just left standing on the stand over and over again, really consistently. I was also able to cut with the false edge and made it almost all the way through tatami mats, but of course the biggest challenge with that is that the false edge is much shorter than the true edge, and so you have a much smaller cutting surface. Where I think this sword really shines, though, is in the handling. This thing is just a joy to wield. During cutting with a group, people just kept coming back to this sword in particular because they found it so much fun to swing around. The sword is hilt heavy, but in a way that feels finely tuned and calculated for optimal handling of an otherwise very wide blade. So it's just balanced extremely well against the blade. The grip looks a little small out of the box, but in reality and with use, it's really not. It's just long enough to be able to accommodate a wide variety of grip styles without having any excess grip, either in width or length. Again, it's just perfectly balanced. Overall, I'm very pleased with the Soldat. It's a nicely put together sword. It's an excellent cutter. It feels lively in the hand, to quote Squaligrim. Really, my only reservation that I found was just with the edge. It was just a touch inadequate to use against the media that I use whenever I cut swords. I know that Albion and Cult of Athena both offer sharpening services, but while I was reluctant to put a $1,300 sword to the grinder, it ended up working out well for me. It's just something that I would call out if you're looking at buying a sword and don't have the means to sharpen it yourself, that you may end up needing to sharpen it or you may be disappointed in the cutting performance. I hope you found this video enjoyable or useful in any way. If you did, please be sure to click the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good one.